thank you to USB Ed for this fantastic opportunity. And kind of the spoiler is in the introduction, which is, of course, that we are suddenly doing this all across Africa, simultaneously, connecting in the interest of expanding knowledge and learning new things. And thank you so much to USB Ed for this lovely invitation and for the wonderful work they're doing all across Africa to spread the importance of management and leadership and executive education. Thank you, colleagues. It's fantastic to be with you. I'm sure, just like me, you've been on thousands of Zooms, and so I'll give you just sort of the heart of my message. I will be asking a few questions as we go along, and we'd love for you to participate. So please do comment in the chats, and there will be an opportunity, as Laura said, towards the end. What I'll essentially share with you, colleagues, and I'll share my screen in a moment, is a set of scenarios that we developed at the Institute for Futures Research. And what I invite you to do is to think about two things, reflect on two things as the session evolves. One, the methodology that I'll share. Think about the merit of such a methodology and how you might use it, and of course whether you and your management team may benefit from such a method for your own organization. And then also think about the application of that method to both your organization and your national context. And I think if you have those two reflections, you will find the most benefit from the session. So as always, we observe that education is dramatically changed. We're not trying to teach you anything. We're essentially inviting you to navigate your own intellect. And this is just a structure, a framework by which you might do that. So please do join me as we embark on this experience. I'm going to share my screen with you and then just minimize it like that. So just for those of you new to the Institute for Futures Research, USB Ed is a very close collaborator with us. We sit on the same campus, and we do a number of projects together. Just for interest, the Institute for Futures Research was the first and remains the only institute for the study of the future on the entire African continent at an academic institution. But most of our work, I should say, is not pure academic in nature. We have a postgraduate program, but most of our work is in fact like this, either in an advisory capacity or in an executive education capacity, where we help typically senior leaders in typically larger organizations to conceive of both possible, probable, and also preferable futures. So most of our work with real managers, with real P&Ls, having to make real decisions in very complex environments. And I'll share just one of those models with you. I'm pleased to tell you that the creation of this framework that I'll share with you was published in this book. Now just look at that title, and that will tell you something about the speed in which this book was published. If you think about the normal turnaround time for books, we started doing this just before the lockdown here in South Africa, anticipating what might be on its way. And within just about 21 days, a number of thought leaders came together and produced this book, Managing Organizations During the COVID-19 Vortex. And there's been an enormous amount of interest, as you heard from Laura, on the media, various media houses, also in all sorts of publications. You can have a look at it. Perhaps the first thing I should do is share with you something about our philosophy on futures. Just a few little principles to bear in mind, because I think that will shape some of the model that I'll share with you. The first very important principle is that in our philosophy, more than one future is always possible. That is an extremely important principle for future science, because it gets us away from so-called singular futures and this kind of rather simplified dialogue of the so-called new normal. Just to give you an example, just a few months ago, Trump was the new normal, and before that, Brexit was the new normal, and before that, 9/11 was the new normal, and then Islamic terrorism was the new normal, and then the dot-com bubble was the new normal, and then the dot-com crash was the new normal, and then the Berlin Wall was the new normal. And so there's an enormous temptation in a time of crisis to use whatever the status quo is to describe the totality of the future. That is an enormous temptation, and it is, in our view, in our philosophy, enormously flawed. Of course, when you're inside the crisis, it's very difficult to see anything else. Just imagine that you were Gorbachev as the wall was being chopped down, and you thought, this wall will define the entire future. How many of us are talking about the wall today? So multiple possible futures, more than one future is always possible. Very importantly then, the seeds of all those possible futures exist today. It exists in the status quo, it's already here. But that a spectrum of possibility will be produced. In other words, the future is not one thing. And even when we get to a singular future, it will itself be many things. Think, for example, of the, let's say, the development of transportation. Human beings develop the bicycle. Okay, so surely that's the end of human walking, right? Why would anyone ever walk again if we can use a bicycle? Well, then we invent the motorbike. So surely that's the end of bicycles, right? Actually, as it turns out, bicycles are now a bigger industry since we invented the bicycle. Then we invented the motor car. Surely that's the end of the motorcycle. Not so. Motorcycles are now a bigger industry than ever before. And so what I'm really just inviting you with these few high-level thoughts on the philosophy of futures is to avoid the trap, as difficult as that is inside the crisis, of thinking of the future as just one thing. We know that the future is complex, and we know that it's multifactorial, and this model is guided by that idea of multifactoriality. So just in terms of broad sort of approaches in futures houses, you typically have kind of two opposing schools of thought. The ones on the left there are quantitative. They're interested in the numbers, essentially. They're predictive. They want to guess something like the exchange rate or the exact numbers. And they are essentially projecting from the past and the present. In our school, we lean a little bit towards the right there. We are interested in intractable problems, really complex multifactorial problems, so-called wicked problems, an idea developed by Weber in the 70s already. In other words, problems that cannot be solved in 4 easy steps, otherwise everyone would be doing it. We're interested in deeply opaque problems, in other words, difficult to really see what's going on exactly, and the corona crisis is an example. And as I mentioned, we're interested in very complex problems. And so our approach is typically narrative, qualitative rather than quantitative, and that allows for a lot of fluidity. And one of the reasons that we do that is that we feel that there's certainly a gap in the market there in terms of high quality, qualitative futures work. And what that does is it really connects with hearts and minds and helps people to imagine an alternative future. So just a few thoughts then on the overall philosophy. You can see I got a bit carried away with the animations there. A few pointers then just as a general sense of our approach to scenarios. I've already observed that we lean towards a qualitative rather than quantitative approach, that we're interested in interpretational sense making. We try to look at the landscape, and then we try to get a sense of what's going on. We try to build a sort of intellectual architecture based on what's going on, rather than guessing, as so many futures houses all over the world, including highly respected research institutions, have fallen prey to this idea that they want to guess the mortality rate, for example, and actually in the process have completely destroyed their own credibility. Some of that is relevant to governments also. Some of you will remember the projections by some of the British research institutes, projecting millions of people to die. 3.4% of the population was the original figure, and so on. So we're non-predictional, non-projectional. That doesn't mean we don't investigate the future, but I'll talk a little bit about the way in which we do that. We recognize, of course, that the future happens at various levels, not just at government level, but at organizational level, at family level, at individual level. And what's important in the way that we think about scenarios is we're essentially, in our philosophy, voluntarist in nature. In other words, we believe in the power of agency. And if you're in management, executive education, it's really important that you should believe in agency. In other words, in the ability of senior people to design alternative futures. In other words, a leadership role that says we're not satisfied with the current future. We want to explore what those futures might be and then design an alternative narrative for that. We know, of course, that there's a multi-narrative. Everyone has a story. We're not tendentious. In other words, we don't decide what the future is beforehand and then try to prove it, as many politicians try to do. Our philosophy of the future is then guided by this idea that the future emerges essentially at the intersection of multiple drivers. As these multiple factors play in on each other, a kind of future pops out in terms of relative probability and preferability. Now, you can hear that engaging with these kind of dimensions of higher order thinking is actually busy work. It's high energy work. But our view is that we can't afford intellectual laziness. And just kind of guess numbers and then correct them as we go along. We'd rather apply a much more discerning methodology. Our approach then, because we're interested in executive development, is strategic in nature. In other words, it has everything to do with what your organization is trying to achieve given the context that it finds itself in, not simply reaction-based. And then it's probabilistic. We work with probability. We don't believe in the idea that the future is somehow already determined and is simply something that we need to head towards. Okay, so with all of that background, what's the point? So as we started building these scenarios, one of the first questions you want to ask in building scenarios is what's likely to drive the future of whatever you're trying to investigate? What are the main forces, the main drivers behind that? Now, of course, you're all familiar with PESTLE, but that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm particularly talking about the kind of specific applied drivers for a specific issue. Now, what we did to produce a model that is as universally applicable as possible is we essentially looked at the probable behavior of humans. There's an example of a human on the left. May or may not be the best example. So we looked at the behavior of the humans, and then I think what's interesting about this particular scenario set is we looked at that in relationship to, that's an important phrase, in relationship to the behavior of the virus. In other words, we said, simply put, humans are going to behave in a certain way. The virus is going to behave in a certain way. When these two behave in relation to each other, what are the possible scenarios that emerge? That's one of the most difficult things to come up for a scenario set in the first place. Beyond kind of the obvious technology stuff and the political stuff and the economic stuff, that's all relevant. But you can read all of that online. What we try to do with a creative scenario set, and that's an important focus for us, we try to be creative. Creativity, by the way, is one of the first casualties of a crisis, together with truth, of course. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But the reason that creativity is one of the first casualties in a crisis is that there's a psychological response to a crisis. And typically, that response is an attempt to revert to what we know. The reason for that is a sort of universal human need in the search for certainty. We try to discover what can we in fact anchor our views on. It's a natural response. The problem with that response, as tempting and seductive as it is that it essentially takes you back to a set of thoughts that you had before the crisis. Whereas what the crisis now requires is an innovative, creative response. So simply put, the typical response in a crisis is the worst possible response to a crisis. Think, for example, about the typical response in the stunning rush for the procurement of loo rolls. Of course, we had this amazing phenomena in the last few weeks where a toilet roll was more expensive than a barrel of oil. Now, even just a few days later, yes, we can see the silliness of that dramatic overreaction. But that's just a sort of anecdotal bit of evidence of the psychological response to a crisis. We want to narrow things down. We want to run for cover, run for safety. And what you'll typically hear, I always find it absolutely astonishing, that instead of treating the crisis, whatever the crisis is, as a learning opportunity, what most people do is they treat it as confirmation bias. In other words, if you were into whatever it was before the coronavirus crisis, your view is that now is the time to go back to that. Whether it's yoga or technology or politics or science or religion or philosophy or exercising or whatever it was, before the virus, for most people, the response is, that's the very thing I need to go back to. Now, a crisis, therefore, presents an opportunity for creative exploration. Of course, what we would argue as futurists, it would have been fantastic to have the creative exploration before the crisis hit in the first place. But that's some of the other work we do. So, just to introduce you then to the model in the way that it was conceived of, we looked at the behavior of humans, we looked at the behavior of the virus, and we looked at how these two are likely, that's an important word, likely to play in on each other. Okay, so when we looked at the social dimension then, that's in reference to the human on the left there, it's clear that whatever humans will do will have a structural component as well as a behavioral component. What do we mean by that? There's an architecture in the society. Think about Africa. Think about roads. Think about the healthcare infrastructure. Think about transport infrastructure. Think about access to water, hygiene, urbanization versus those in rural areas. There's a structural component that will inevitably shape the way that humans behave. But, and this is an important but, there's also a behavioral component which is driven by choice. In other words, even though certain structures may increase the probability of behavior, people will still make choices. And so that's a really important dimension when you're trying to understand humans. I read a little article not too long ago called "What Will the Humans Do?" What will the humans do? And this is just a very simple way of just starting a response to that question. So to remind you just the social dimension and the virus dimension, and on the social dimension, we said there's a structural component, just the way the world is organized. Think about inequality, for example. And there's a behavioral component, which is the kind of choices that people are likely to make. Okay, so if that's how we conceived of the humans, and I'll get to more detail as we move along, here's just an example from the South African context, and you can think of your own context in your own country on some of the structural dimensions there. So you can see on the left there, for example, you know, it's a tongue-in-cheek reference to the public transport system here in South Africa. You know, a taxi driver arrested for transporting 26 passengers in a 16-seater minibus. That's a structural component of transport. And so when you're asking people, for example, to isolate and to practice social distancing in a structural public transport system with that character, well, you can see what is the likelihood that people are going to comply. On the right is another example, and you can think of examples from your own national region. An example there, when we think about the importance of hygiene, for example, these messages that keep being repeated about the importance of hand washing, you can see that, and this is from the South African government's own statistic, and I'll only point out that less than half of all households in South Africa, as an example, have access to water in their own homes. That is an absolutely staggeringly important insight to have when you're thinking about how likely people are to comply. If you can only find running water by moving outside your house and finding a tap within 200 meters of where you live, how on God's green earth are you going to comply with isolation in your own home? So these are just some examples of the structural components when we're trying to anticipate the likelihood of human behavior. If we look then at the behavioral components, these are just examples again of the kind of choices that people might make. South Africa, just as an example, is widely regarded as, if not the, then one of the protest capitals of the world. We like a bit of protest for whatever reason, and we can debate whether it's justified or not, but the point is that the character of the society that we're studying, whether it's this one or any other society, is essentially driven by a series of patterns. And this is just an example of a pattern. There's another example of a pattern on the right there, where the country is internationally renowned for its drunk driving. People who really just don't demonstrate any responsibility there. So when you look then at these structural components and these patterns of choice in the human dimension, then the question is, how likely is it that the society is going to comply with whatever level of disaster state has been published in your country? Okay, so that was the human dimension then. A structural component, here are some examples, and a behavioral choice-driven agency-based component, and you can see some examples there. Okay, but then that's just one part of the story. That's an important principle. We try to, of course, create a rich story when we're developing scenarios. Otherwise, the scenarios are so shallow and so single dimension oriented that really weak leadership decisions are made. Let's then look at the virus. So when we looked at society, we looked essentially at the probability of compliance, and we looked at structural and behavioral components. When we looked at the virus, we essentially looked at viral virulency. In other words, how powerful is this thing? How powerful is it? And the dimensions that we included there are firstly transmissibility or infectivity. In other words, how likely is it that the virus will be transferred from one person to another, and that other person will then be infected. The next dimension we looked at is morbidity or severity. In other words, even if you do get infected, how serious is it? Now you can see some of these dimensions starting to play out in the media now, that those who were hoping to be absolute in their quantitative approach are now showing themselves as having egg on their faces, because the transmissibility was completely exaggerated and the morbidity was completely exaggerated. Then we look at lethality. So in other words, how likely is it that you get it? If you get it, how bad is it going to get? Even if it's very bad, how likely are you to die from this virus? Brutal as that question is. And again, perhaps the likelihood is nowhere near what was anticipated by some of the other fused houses. And then the mutation rate. And this one we know very little about at the moment. The mutation rate, essentially the ability of the virus to adapt, the common flu virus has an amazing ability to adapt and mutate. Okay, so for the social dimension, we look at structural elements, people are just moving in the architecture, and behavioral components. How compliant is the society generally in terms of its overall patterns? And then in viral virulency, we looked at can you be easily infected? How serious is it? Will you die from it? And how likely is it that this virus will mutate? Okay, so when we look at the probable future behavior, I found this really quite fascinating of the virus. If you looked at infectivity, for example, in relation to lethality, and this is just an example of how you can enrich your own understanding of scenarios by drilling down into more of the sub-drivers. If we look at infectivity in relation to lethality, what's really fascinating about this is the first difficulty, of course, is to determine the level of infectivity or transmissibility, and then the level of lethality. But what's really fascinating is that a typical viral pathway into the future is that it will mutate towards greater infectivity. In other words, the goal of a virus in its own evolution, just as the society has its own evolution, the goal of a virus is to increase its own infectivity rate. In other words, to infect more and more people in better and better ways. But what's really interesting to me is that the likely pathway for development of lethality is that way. In other words, what the virus will try to do is to infect more and more people, but very importantly, as it mutates, it will attempt to kill fewer and fewer people. Why? Because that is in its own evolutionary interest. If it kills its own host, it is essentially committing suicide. And so the fascinating thing as this virus develops is that it is moving towards that quadrant there. Higher infectivity and lower lethality. And you can see that with the common cold, for example. Why this is fascinating is it's really important to ask, what is the fundamental model that guides government decision-making on phenomena such as a total, almost hermetic lockdown? What is the model? Now, the first problem is that that seems to be a secret in most countries. It's completely unclear which model is guiding the decision-making. For us, that's a really important question. What is the model that's informing your behavior? Call it your paradigm, if you like. I have to apologize for using the word paradigm. It's I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, of course. It's a legal requirement for a futurist to use the word paradigm at least 26 times a day, and I have to comply. But for us, it's important to understand what your paradigm is that informs, let's say, your lockdown behavior, because if the model is wrong, well, then whatever you instruct on lockdown is going to be wrong also. And I have a very strong suspicion that for the vast majority of countries, not only is the model not clear, the lockdown approach and the model are completely disconnected. And you can see that if you make decisions like this as an executive, the consequences are absolutely dire. And you'll be embarrassed, in fact, and we're expecting a lot of governments to be very embarrassed as we start to emerge from the lockdown. Okay. Laura, perhaps I could just pause there for a moment and ask if there are any observations or specific questions you'd like to share.
Right. If anybody has any questions, don't you want to pop it in the chat box for us? We haven't had any comments yet so far. Okay.
I'm going to treat silence as consent and crack away.
I think you have us all very enthralled this side.
Well, that's very kind, Laura. Thank you. Okay. And Laura, what we'll do in the scenarios that I'm going to build now is we're going to look at them dimension by dimension, and then just ask participants to give a few responses, and you'll give us some feedback as we go along.
Sure.
Okay, colleagues, thank you for the patience. I appreciate the fact, of course, that that what Zoom doesn't have, despite the name, is the Zoom required for real face-to-face engagement. And I have to tell you that in our view, one of the new sciences that will emerge after COVID is the magic of face-to-face communication. Something we've never really had to study because we've never had a model to compare it to. But now we have Zoom, and Zoom is great for sharing information. It's not so great for establishing trust, for discerning authenticity, for being jointly creative as a team. But anyway, that's something we can get to perhaps towards the end if you want to discuss what happens after this. So when we start to build these scenarios then, you know, the strange thing is you're always starting with a blank slate, just sort of saying, well, you know, where do we in fact start? And why I want to point that out is, as easy as it is to criticize or critique any scenario set, it's important just to note that producers of scenarios spend an enormous amount of very intensive intellectual energy to present something that other people can critique. It's almost like the work that artists do in producing a song, a poem, a piece of literature, a dance, an opera, a rap song, for the rest of the world to evaluate against. But I must also say that as scenario builders, we are highly feedback fit. In fact, our scenarios are not presented as predictions. That is not the main purpose of a scenario set. The reason we build scenarios is that we want to firstly look at multiple factors, and secondly, we want to then sketch those various scenarios and then work with all sorts of panels of experts to think about what's more probable and what's more preferable. So I've told you how we've done it. We've looked firstly at the relationship between what will the humans do and what will the virus do. And when these two connect, what kind of futures will emerge from that interaction? So when we looked at the human behavior, the main dimension we looked at there is social compliance. In other words, to what degree are people likely to comply with government regulations during this crisis and with health protocols, which, by the way, existed before. Hand washing is not a new thing, and staying away from other humans, I've been practicing it as far as I could. I'm not much of a hugger myself. But how likely is it, we asked here, that humans are going to comply with the regulation? And Laura, what I'd like to ask the participants is just to go into the chat space, and all I want them to write in there is just the words low, medium, or high in response to this question. In your country, how likely is it that the general population is going to comply with government regulations in whatever level of disaster state you have in your country, and with health protocols required typically by the Minister of Health? How likely are they to comply? Would you say that's low, medium, or high? And we'll just give them a few seconds to respond, Laura, and then you can tell us what you're noticing.
Thanks everyone for commenting. Keep commenting. We're getting a lot of mediums, mostly mediums, and a few lows.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, mostly mediums.
Do let us know if that changes. So we're seeing a sort of mix then between low and medium. We can see a few more comments coming in. Are you noticing any highs there, Laura?
No highs. There's one or two very lows.
Yeah, very low.
Actually, Mauritius is from someone has let me know Mauritius high.
Ah, very good.
One has come through, yes.
Okay. Well, isn't Mauritius a bit special? Okay. Always showing off a bit. So what can we say based on this feedback? So just to talk about the method, colleagues, what you could do is you could compile an expert panel. I have the privilege of having 80 of you in my expert panel today, and you can see the enormous instantaneous power of such an informed panel. It just ensures that the development of scenarios is not just your own views. Scenario building is very much a team sport, I should say, not something that you just invent in the dark recesses of your mind at 2 a.m. in the morning. So what can we say about this feedback from our expert panel from across Africa? Well, we can say that when we look at a general cross-section, and of course not all 54 countries are presented, but what we can say is that the view seems to be that given the structural components and the behavioral components, our expert panel is arguing that across large parts of Africa, social compliance is going to be low to medium. That's an important bit of feedback. And so what that already starts to do is it moves us towards a future that's slightly more likely and away from a future that's slightly less likely, just as we're at the nascent stages of building the scenario set. Okay, let's now look at the behavior of the virus. And there, just to remind you, we looked at viral virulency. So we looked at transmissibility or infectivity, morbidity or severity, mortality or lethality, and mutation rate. And of course, with certain dimensions in a scenario set, it depends on the expert panel you have whether a vote is in fact useful or not. This I find extremely concerning when I look at certain governments' responses to the lockdown crisis. They seem to be subjecting science to a popular political vote. That would be like, asking my opinion on the, what is the next planet that's likely to be discovered. I mean, there's absolutely no foundation for my response. I can give you an opinion and I can vote, but it is meaningless in the contribution. So when we look at the science in this case, then what we can say is that we're not looking at a kind of Ebola virus here, right? And at the same time, we're also not quite looking at the common flu or the common cold. We're looking at a virus that is somewhere here. And if you respect infectivity, then you may want to say somewhere in that region over there. So if we look then at that in relation to, there's that phrase, in relation to social compliance, and we have a bit of a broad bit of feedback there, anywhere from sort of, medium to low, some were saying very low, then you can already see what's starting to happen with this very simple little framework. We're starting to notice that the likelihood is, and we're not predictors once again, but the probability is starting to lean in this direction, where the viral virulency is fairly strong, nowhere near as lethal as we originally thought, and that social compliance is going to be low to medium. So that starts to tell a story, which will be very different, for example, from a story in which you will have very high compliance and very low viral virulence. You can see those two stories, those two narratives are completely different. And what we're noticing now with the use of our expert panel and some robust scientific input is one scenario is starting to emerge as slightly more probable than the other. Okay, we are, of course, complexity, students, and that means that we're not satisfied until it's overwhelmingly complex. I criticize myself there. So what we like to do is to enrich the scenario set with a number of additional variables. And one of those variables that we thought simply cannot be ignored is what is the probability that government in your country has the capacity, the competence to enforce its own here, whether at this stage, we're not really debating whether they were good at communicating the lockdown or not. Here, I'm really asking about execution. Once again, just to give us a low, medium, and high on how confident they are that the government is able to implement, execute, and enforce its own regulations with regards to a crisis like that. We're looking for a low, medium, or high. Let's see what people think.
On the previous question, somebody commented that Mauritius has a large police force, which can be very encouraging for compliance.
Yes.
So, that was raised. So we've got highs and mediums, it would seem. Lots of highs and a few mediums.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting indeed.
Someone said there's one low.
Right. Yes.
They're saying that government is setting regulations that are impossible to enforce.
Aha. Right.
High,
yes.
High. Yeah, lots of highs, medium to high.
That's very interesting. In South Africa, for example, you know, one of the fascinating things was we had Ramaphosa coming out in the early days of COVID, early days being just a few days ago, and he was finally the confident, assertive statesman we were all hoping for. We were all enormously impressed, finally taking charge. You know, we were hoping he'd kind of, you know, rise to the occasion, finally shake off the legacy of the deals he made with the devil to become the president. And then just a few days later, we're debating, can you smoke? Can you take your dog for a walk? Now we're debating, can you buy open-toe sandals? I kid you not. So this, unfortunately, has been the pattern in much of our government, and your government, you know, will have its own patterns. That at a policy level, really superb. We have one of the best constitutions on the planet, praised at the highest institutions in the world. But, and in South Africa, we like to say, but however, we're the only country that uses both of those. But however, that's because we like to disagree with each other. But however, when it comes to implementation, execution, it's not so great. And then the government did a really strange thing. They called in the military. And Laura, I have a sneaky suspicion, although I will not ask participants to respond to my suspicion, that one of the reasons that several people have commented that enforcement is going to be quite good is not because of the implementation ability of the government, but sadly, and someone's alluded to that, the rather military paramilitary style of enforcing regulations. We've seen, for example, in various places, the military getting involved, frog marching the vulnerable citizens back to their dwellings, and certainly not doing so with those who are likely to take them to court for non-compliance. Okay, so what we're noticing then, Laura, is that not only are we starting to develop, I must tell you, I'm trying to focus here while my son is trying to get my attention on my right here. This is just the reality of Zoom. He's a bit of a clown and a joker. Good morning, Jonathan. Now go away, I'm working. We're starting to just see the scenario developing not only here with moderate viral virulency, low to moderate or medium compliance. But what surprisingly to me, what a lot of people are saying is on an enforcement level, we're actually seeing that we're moving sort of in that direction over there. So you can see, colleagues, just looking at that diagram, and by the way, the diagram is important. The visuals are extremely important because it tries to facilitate a principle that we call simultaneous referencing. In other words, trying to look at multiple factors at the same time. And images, pictures, as anyone in marketing will tell you, is a very, very powerful way of doing that. Because you can see what's now happened is that we've suddenly gone exponentially from 4 scenarios when we were there. We've suddenly gone from 4 scenarios to 8 when we look at government enforcement. And so what we're arguing now is that this scenario seems like the most probable when it comes to how this is going to play out in your region. And so you can begin to tell a story around this. I'm doing this very quickly, of course, in a few minutes, but the building of scenarios can take anything from a day to 6 months, depending on who you consult with and what kind of data you gather. Okay, of course, we're going to introduce more, and I spoiled the surprise by over-clicking earlier, but the next dimension we're going to look at is health system responsiveness. In other words, a system that is particularly relevant to this crisis. How likely is it, and Laura, I'm going to ask people again to reflect on their own health system in their own countries. And here's the question: how likely is it that your health system is going to be agile, responsive, professional in its reaction to the current crisis? We're looking again for a low, medium, or high.
Ethiopia low.
Yeah.
Sorry, and Mauritius is coming in high.
There's a lot of them are coming in at high. Just while people are thinking about this, I should say that, of course, one of the dilemmas here is that there is just such a discrepancy in many countries between the public health system run by the government and the private health system run, of course, by the private sector. And the differences seem absolutely vast. And what's fascinating, I'll ask your feedback in a moment, but what's fascinating is that we're also now realizing the extent of the reality. There's almost a sort of audit of the situation while we're in a crisis. For example, we're finally discovering how many quarantine beds we have in the country, or how many emergency room beds we have, and how many beds in total we have in hospitals, private and public, in the country. And so what this often does is it makes you have a close look and gets you away from the typical boardroom debate discussion, people giving general kind of opinions. The broader your panel, the more accurate your information. Okay, Laura, what have we got?
So what I can see is a few people have commented with their country, which is quite helpful. Mauritius seems to consistently say high. And then there are mostly, I would say, lows next to that, with maybe a few mediums, but I'd say there's a lot of lows, with Mauritius claiming to be high.
Okay, very good. So you can see that you can do this by region. And so if you're Mauritius, always trying to show off about how fancy you are, you can say, I love Mauritius, who doesn't? You could say, well, we're going to be quite compliant. We're going to have more or less the same strain, although, by the way, there are different strains. But we're going to be quite compliant. Our government's going to be pretty strong at enforcing it, and we're going to be pretty high in our health system responsiveness. And that may be really distinct for another country which may have very low social compliance, facing this moderate level of virulency, with perhaps lower levels of government implementation and lower levels of health system responsiveness. And now you can see, colleagues, why there is no such thing as the future. There is only multiple futures. And the more you look at the interaction between drivers, the more you can start to examine what is more probable in your case. And then getting back to my introduction, think about the high quality decisions that need to be made to respond to that. So just to conclude here, if we're looking at the sort of general consensus, then Laura, we're saying, am I right that some people, there were some exceptions like Mauritius that were quite high. Some people, most people perhaps are saying we're probably sort of in that region over there. Not a complete disaster, but not exactly shooting the lights out.
Yes, I'd agree.
And so you can see that now, faced with 16 scenarios, by the way, all of which are possible, we can see that some of those scenarios are simply more probable than others. And what you could do is you could do a kind of Delphi with an expert panel and ask people to rate the probability of these various scenarios. So the diagram is deceptively simple, but of course hides a very high degree of thinking, careful consideration of the drivers, and a lot of data behind it. So of course we're not satisfied. As they say in the Verimark adverts, there's more. So what we like to do then is to introduce into some of the most probable scenarios a number of so-called scenario archetypes. In other words, typical players that you find in almost any scenario with any problem, with any situation that you're going to face. One of those archetypes is what we refer to as the wild card. This is a role player that comes kind of out of left field. No matter how brilliant your plans are, no matter how much you've prepared or how many resources you have, this is the kind of your crazy cousin that comes and stays with you for 6 weeks. Just something you didn't expect. I'm sharing too much about my own family. Something you didn't expect, something that just surprises you, and that may sort of put the cat amongst the pigeons, if you like. And in this scenario set, one of the wild cards that we looked at was the role of labor unions, organized labor. And in fact, we said, and I'm pleased to announce this, that we got this one right, that as the lockdown, for example, extends, the voice of labor unions will start to be heard increasingly. And that's exactly what we're seeing. By the way, I'm keeping quiet about all the other things I got wrong, and I'm just underlining this one, which I got right, which is that the labor unions are going to be louder and louder, and we're certainly seeing that. And of course, it's looking back, scenarios are always obvious. And when you look back now, it's really quite obvious that as businesses have been placed in virtual lockdown and couldn't trade, of course, revenue has taken an enormous hammering, and the reality is that security of tenure for staff is just very fragile now. And so one of the obvious ways to cut costs is to, and for many organizations, that can be anything between 50 and 66% of turnover. The jobs are in danger. And so you can anticipate that labor unions are going to make their voices heard. And one of the interesting questions is whether labor unions will now finally embrace the opportunity to become a 21st century type organization, or whether they will remain the labor unions of the late 1800s and continue, as they did in the 1900s, to threaten complete disability of the commercial enterprise if their wishes are not being heard. And so what you could do then is you could go into some of the more probable scenarios for your region, factor in the wild card, and start telling the story of their likely behavior. Okay, that's the wild card. There's another one we like to think about, which is particularly relevant in a crisis. And that is something that can moderate, calm down the madness, and perhaps be a catalyst for a more positive outcome. And in this instance, we combined those, and we particularly looked as the moderator and catalyst at the media. Here, for example, in our part of the world, we have an amazing, free, high-quality, investigative fourth estate, as the media is sometimes known. And very high quality reporting. And this gets you away from the kind of insanity of social media with conspiracy theories and the full benefit of Trump's wisdom as a specialist epidemiologist, and gets you towards what's actually happening, and also holds government to account, especially with the risk in the scenarios that we've now identified of a kind of exacerbated enforcement behavior by government. And then you'll see that I've added higher education there, kind of USB Ed enterprise, offering high quality thinking to senior people so that they can make higher order decisions in order to moderate the crisis that they're facing. And then just finally, Laura, and then we'll conclude, we're looking for an integrator, something that can pull this all together somehow. And one of those that we looked at is the role of business. And business has played a really fascinating role when we looked at these scenarios. The relationship between business and government, unfortunately, in many African countries, is not nearly what it should be. In South Africa, for example, according to the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, the relationship between business and government out of 119 countries is 101. By the way, on the same index, in the relationship between business and labor out of 119 countries, South Africa rates number 119. So in other words, business would have been almost justified in playing an outsider role. But what did they do? In our case here in South Africa, for example, they played an astonishingly integrating role. The Rupert family, the Oppenheimer family, the Motsepe family, and their related organizations such as Sanlam, Momentum, Old Mutual played a role. They all started contributing to a fund that could integrate and keep the tenuous connections With scenarios, we often do something like that. We try to create a little icon to illustrate a message, and you'll see the dollar sign there is reversed. And that's just a reminder to us that this may be an opportunity now for business to play not only an integrator role, but also to use this hiatus to reconsider its relationship with the environment and really understand that if it doesn't have a healthy relationship with the planet, we risk an increasing frequency of these kinds of crises. The wild card, the moderator catalyst, and the integrator. So colleagues, I've shared with you some of our thinking behind developing these scenarios. I've shared with you a little bit of the methodology on how to build them, something around how to use an expert panel to think about where your region or your organization is leaning on various dimensions, so that you can start talking about which one of these scenarios might be more probable. In other words, we're not destined for a particular future. Which one of them is plausible? In other words, could be argued quite well. And then which one is preferable? What would you rather have? And that's going to require some very serious higher order decision making. Laura, I'm going to pause there for the last few moments we have and see if there are any responses. People are welcome to comment on the use of a model like this, or the nature of this method, or even ask some questions about it if they want.
Thank you, Morne. Participants, you're welcome to ask some questions. If you can use the raise hand functionality, when I see you, then I can unmute you, and then you're welcome to ask your question to Morne. So we'd love to have some interaction right now. I'm sure you must be brimming with questions for Morne. While we wait for that, Morne, thank you so much. That was so enlightening. Just to be able to look at it through these scenarios, in 16 scenarios, it really, I think it gives us a way of dealing with these, because we're all dealing with this on some level or the other, whether it's as a business or whether it's personally. And I think having a framework like this really does allow you to look at it through a much more logical framework.
You're so right, Laura, because, you know, as I said, one of the things that crisis does is logic goes out of the window. And
Yeah.
so, for example, we argued that if you look at the behavior of the society when the crisis broke, and the behavior of the market when the crisis broke, it was clear that both the society in terms of toilet roll buying and the market in terms of selling thought that the worst case scenario was also the most probable scenario. In other words, a completely illogical reaction. What we're seeing with a model like this is you can compare the worst case scenario with the most probable scenario and then be much more discerning in your decision making.
If you, do we have a question? David, did you have a question?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say thank you for Dr. Mura and a very interesting presentation. You raised a very important two scenarios, that is a psychological and at the same time the structural scenario. And my question is how these scenarios can interact each other, where it interact each other in order to develop a model for decision making. Sometimes within these scenarios, there are a lot of variables are there, so that in order to manage these things together, to develop a specific model for decision, sometimes very difficult. So I want to, know your view on this issues actually. Very interesting issues. And that one of the other questions is you raised the issue of relation between government and business, and at the same time business and labor in Africa in general. You raised an example in South Africa. South Africa is one of the country more progress compared to other Africa countries. So, this relation, how it will create difficulties to develop decision model in Africa under this situation. And I need your view on that regard. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Those are two great questions. Just in response to the first question, the way to get the most out of these scenarios for decision making is, in practice, we all have pet theories, right? We all have pet theories. When the tablet came out, we thought, oh, well, that's the end of teachers, right? And so that kind of thinking gets you into a kind of a single factor decision making. So you go, so just to push that example, you go, okay, well, that's the end of teachers. Okay, we're not hiring any more teachers. We're buying thousands of tablets. So you can see this can play out in budgetary terms, very practical organizational things. If you have a single factor decision making, and we often get that with executive teams, where there's a kind of group think. Everybody agrees. They only discuss one or two factors. The CEO will say something like, it's all about the customer. Okay. And then the talent leaves. And then he says, oh, sorry, it's all about the talent. And then, the government changes the regulation. Then he says, oh, it's all about the regulation. So it's, in our view, it's not all about anything. It's all about everything. And so what this model does is it at least makes you look at multiple factors. And then when you make the final decision, and here's really my answer to your question, don't just find your own favorite factor and then vote on that. Use that in the context of the broader multiple factors. You can give them all a weighting. I mean, there are other methods, multi-factor variable analysis and so on. But the point is to use multiple factors rather than singular ones. In the relationship between business and government and labor, one way out that we have proposed in the past is that higher education, research institutions should play a more prominent role in that triangle that you mentioned, business, government, labor. If you introduce higher education there, and the truth is Africa has some amazing research institutions. Ethiopia is blessed with some fantastic high quality scholars. By introducing higher education there, you get out of that triangle and you can move towards, heaven help us, a more evidence-based approach to decision making, and you don't have such enormous contestation. That's only a small part of the answer to your complex question, but I think for Africa, a really important one. If we can move out of, simply the views of irrational leaders towards a more evidence-based approach, and data is hard to come by in Africa, admittedly, then I think we can accelerate very, very rapidly the kind of growth we want. Thanks, Doc.
Thank you very much.
If there's anybody else that would still like to ask a question, please do. If you're uncertain how to use the raise hand functionality, if you're on a computer, on your desktop or your laptop, just hover down to the bar at the bottom where you can mute and start your video, and there'll be a raise hand. You can push on that. Otherwise, you're also welcome to type your question in the chat box. It's a very rare opportunity to have direct access to Dr. Mostert. So if you'd like to ask your question, I'd really encourage you to do so. Morne, either you've completely gobsmacked everybody and they're sorting through this and don't even know how to ask an intelligent question at this point, or you've just made it crystal clear and everybody had a plan for the future.
I doubt both of those, but Laura, I just want to say, as we conclude in these last few minutes, that USB Ed has just created such a great platform where people from across the continent can come together, and I just want to say I'm really grateful also to Ed, but also the colleagues who've dedicated their time to really think about some of the complexity facing us and how scenarios might help within that. And of course, we're very happy to discuss with anybody how they might use methods like these in their own organizations through you, Laura.
Yes. I see there's one question that's come through. What are the business sectors which show resilience to the COVID-19?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. One way to think about it is that there's really no such thing as post-COVID. There's only post-lockdown. Yeah. And so the question is whether when we think about organizational resilience, and it's a great question, one of the questions is it resilient to the lockdown or is it resilient to a pandemic? Because the lockdown is really a temporary engagement. And if you look at the statistics, then when we look at sectors, certainly size plays an important role here. So small business, for example, is extremely vulnerable to the lockdown. Very few small businesses will have more than 2 months complete and total cash flow in reserve. Bear in mind that there will also be additional costs in coming out of the lockdown. So that just in terms of the overall structure. So naturally, larger corporates are a little bit more resilient because they tend to have a bit more in reserve. Then it's I think obvious to say that organizations that have been digitizing at a rapid rate before COVID are definitely finding themselves in an advantageous position. And so, for example, construction and manufacturing have found themselves typically extremely vulnerable to COVID, as has, of course, certain parts of the transport sector, obviously the aviation industry. But that's partially because of the lockdown rather than because of the nature of the pandemic. But as the future unfolds, one anticipates that aviation is going to be vulnerable because of the overall risk of pandemic in the short to medium term. So even though you'll be allowed to fly, a lot of consumers will opt out of it and experiment first with digital platforms before they incur both the financial cost and the health risk of getting on a plane. And we've already heard sort of ridiculous examples, and Ryanair has pointed out that it's silly, that middle seats shouldn't be occupied coming out. I mean, that's almost like ordering a coffee in one cup of which only half has milk in it. It's just a silly idea. So I'd say highly digitized organizations are a little bit ahead. Having said that, there has been an enormous acceleration in digitization over the last few weeks. Everything that wasn't digital before is suddenly digital now. And so I expect, by the way, that face-to-face will be revisited for its enormous value in business. And we will be a lot more discerning about the kind of work that can be done digitally and the kind of work that actually should not be done digitally. It would be a really bad idea to have a completely creative session using Zoom and Zoom only. You will need the energy of those around you and feel their trust and interest in you to really be creative. So I think the implications are across the board from, I mean, we often talk about the food, energy, water nexus. And in food, for example, there will certainly in the short term be a kind of response towards health. That's been a trend that happened before COVID, but it'll accelerate in this instance. I should point out, Laura, that the typical, one of the typical responses to a crisis is an overreaction, as we've now said. You know, humans, it's only accountants and economists that think humans are balanced. Everyone else realizes that humans are not machines, they behave typically like humans do. And so there's almost always an overreaction before we get back to the balance. And that overreaction will absolutely be in favor of health. And so those industries who can benefit in the short term, there's a window of opportunity for them to show the health benefits of their work, hopefully with integrity. And then they might be able to win some market share in the short term until the balance comes back, which will be some time after typical lockdowns.
Thank you. It doesn't seem like there are any more questions. So
I have one, my last one actually.
Okay.
Very interesting actually. That's why I'm encouraged to ask questions. You raised a question of health system response. How about other infrastructures? Because the COVID-19 affects other infrastructure. The responsiveness of other infrastructure is really very important for our decision model. Then how we are going to put this thing on for decision, the other infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it helps us to understand that no system works in isolation. It's all really interconnected. And so, for example, if you think about the amazing innovation, for example, in Rwanda, in the use of drones, you know, if we thought of drones outside the health system before, then absolutely drones, I think, will overlap very strongly. That technology system will now infiltrate health systems undoubtedly. Think about the benefit of kind of remote testing. Think about the benefit, the sort of technology drive around tele-everything, including tele-diagnosis. What we can also expect, because of the enormous hammering that the business sector has faced, is that I think many countries will now embark, if there are any reserves, will now embark not only on social benefit systems, overall economic social benefit systems, but also on large infrastructure development systems as a way of stimulating the economy. So you're right to ask that great question about the interrelationship between the health system. And unfortunately, in many governments around the world, they don't have the insight that you've just given us, and they're focusing very narrowly on the health system. Consider, it is true, for example, that the health system influences the economic system, but what we're not hearing a lot or enough of, which you're reminding us of, is that the economic system has an impact on the health system. So if you keep the lockdown going for too long and you have permanent scarring on the economic system, you are now counterintuitively affecting the health system, partially because you're not generating revenue through taxes, so the health system can't be funded, but also because you're causing a catastrophe in employment numbers. And that means that at the bottom of the pyramid, people are dropping out of high quality nutrition, for example, and they're dropping out of health insurance. And so you're causing a health problem by trying to avoid a health problem. That kind of circular complex thinking, unfortunately, we're not seeing enough of.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Nay, do you have 1 minute for one more question?
One more.
Okay, it said here, have your scenarios also considered the external environment, for example, fake news?
Yes.
I guess, is herbal remedy providing helpful or the discovery of vaccine?
I know, it's a miracle tea, right? Yeah, with, you know, it's an old adage that the first casualty of war is truth. And war in that observation is just an example of a crisis. And a crisis exposes an enormous number of cracks. It often makes you have a very close look at what's actually going on. You could sort of get away with it when there wasn't a crisis. But when the crisis hits, you have a very close look at what's actually going on. And what we're discovering is that levels of transparency are nowhere near where they should be. For the life of me, for example, I cannot figure out the model that most governments use for the lockdown. I can't see the logic. I'm not sure whether it is that they don't know the logic themselves or whether there is, in fact, no real robust defensible model behind it. Because if there is, why not just publish it? Then we can all debate it. At the same time, of course, a crisis is like a honeypot for conspiracy theorists and crackpots, and social media with no filter means that people can advertise messages with no scientific foundation. And so I think it's an important question because it has very serious implications. And I think that some governments around the world are going to cause more harm than good in the way that they run lockdowns. We need much more discerning, nuanced approaches, sequester the vulnerable, start to release people in a staggered way, monitor and track and trace, and high levels of testing. But it's almost as if some governments around the world just cannot deal with the complexity. And so they've caused a lockdown, stop everything. That's the easy part. Now having a nuanced approach to responding to the virus, that's the complexity. And you can see governments are completely losing it when they have to do that. And I think part of that is because they haven't been transparent about their model and they haven't been clear on the data they're using. They're making political decisions when science is what's important. Science, that's also a complex observation in itself, because health science, as we've just heard from David, shouldn't work in isolation. Doctors are not economic experts. Even economists are not organizational management experts. And so what you need is a multi-science approach. And I fear that a lockdown is a very crude method for dealing with a crisis like this. It's simple. And we often say in complexity, for every problem, there's an answer that's easy, fast, simple, and wrong. And so thinking about multiple dimensions, considering multiple factors, and being clear about your data and the accuracy of that data allows for much more robust decision-making for the long term, which is what we're interested in.
Thank you, Morne. Thank you very, very much for your time this morning and for adding such valuable insight for us. We know that you have many more meetings to go to today. Probably have complete Zoom fatigue already at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. So we thank you so much.